Welcome back to the ACE-CPT exam prep series. This is lesson 7. We're in the domain of program design and implementation. And today we're covering functional assessments: posture, movement, core, balance, and flexibility. Here's the idea at the heart of this lesson. Before you ever load a client with resistance, you need to know how they actually move. Reading posture and movement quality lets you spot imbalances before they turn into injuries. That's the skill we're building today. Let's look at what you'll be able to do by the end of this lesson. There are 4 objectives. First, you'll be able to explain ACE's assessment sequencing principle. In other words, why these tests happen in a specific order. Second, you'll describe the static postural assessment and what it's checking for. Third, you'll identify the 4 movement screens ACE uses. And fourth, you'll explain how core, balance, and flexibility get assessed on top of posture and movement. Keep these in mind as we go. Everything in this lesson builds toward one goal: understanding how a client moves before you ask them to move under load. Let's start with the big picture, because it shapes everything else in this lesson. The guiding principle here is straighten before you strengthen. Step 1. Static posture is checked first, before movement is ever evaluated. You're looking at how the body sits at rest, before it does anything at all. Step 2. Movement screens come next. These are evaluated before anything gets loaded with resistance, so you're watching quality of movement without a barbell or dumbbell adding complexity. Step 3. Core, balance, and flexibility testing round out the picture, filling in the details of how a client actually moves and stabilizes. Notice the order: posture, then movement, then the supporting pieces. That sequence is deliberate, and it's exactly the kind of thing the exam will test you on. Now let's break down the static postural assessment itself. This is done with the client standing relaxed, not posing, not bracing, just standing naturally. You view them from 3 angles: front, side, and back. And it's often done against a plumb line or a grid, so you have a fixed reference to compare against. What are you actually looking at? Head position relative to the shoulders, the curve of the spine, the tilt of the pelvis, and how the knees and feet line up. Each of these is a clue. A forward head, an exaggerated spinal curve, an uneven pelvis. These are the kinds of postural deviations that hint at deeper compensation patterns you'll want to address in programming. Now let's move from standing still to actually moving. The 4 movement screens. First, the bend and lift screen. This watches the squat pattern, how the knees track, whether the spine stays neutral, and whether the heels stay in contact with the ground. Second, the hurdle step. This is a single leg screen, and because it takes away the stability of having 2 feet on the ground, it reveals balance issues, hip control problems, and general stability weaknesses. Third, shoulder push stabilization. This checks how well the core and shoulder girdle stay stable while the client performs a pushing motion. And fourth, thoracic spine mobility, which checks rotational mobility through the upper back, an area that gets stiff easily and affects a lot of upper body movement. 4 screens, 4 different windows into how the body moves under different demands. Together, they build a much fuller picture than posture alone. Let's talk about how core function gets assessed, because it's more specific than most people assume. Core function testing isn't about counting how many sit-ups someone can do. It's about looking at deep stabilizer engagement, specifically the transverse abdominis, often shortened to TVA. This is frequently tested using a pressure biofeedback cuff placed under the low back, which detects subtle changes in pressure as the client engages that deep muscle. Here's the key insight. A client who lacks TVA control tends to substitute the more superficial rectus abdominis instead, the six-pack muscle. That substitution matters because relying on the surface muscle instead of the deep stabilizer is exactly the kind of compensation pattern that can lead to instability and injury down the line. Now let's cover the last 2 pieces: balance and flexibility. Balance is checked under 2 conditions: static, meaning while holding still, and dynamic, meaning while moving. Both give you different information, so both get tested. Flexibility, or muscle length, assessments target the muscles that most commonly get tight in day-to-day life. Hip flexors and calves are the frequent culprits, largely thanks to how much time people spend sitting. Here's an important concept to hold on to. One compensation, many symptoms. A single underlying issue can show up across several different assessments at once. So when you see the same pattern repeating, say tight hip flexors showing up in posture, in the bend and lift screen, and in flexibility testing, don't treat those as three separate problems. Treat them as one connected story. So what do you actually do with all this assessment data? These findings directly shape where a client starts in muscular training, which we'll cover in lessons 9 through 11. If a client shows multiple repeated compensations across these assessments, that typically means starting in the stability phase, building a solid foundation before adding load or complexity. On the other hand, if a client moves cleanly through all 4 screens with no red flags, that can mean starting further along in the training progression. This is the whole point of functional assessment. It's not just an academic exercise, it's the direct input that determines a client's starting point in their program. Let's test what you've learned with a practice question. What principle governs the sequence of ACE's functional assessments? Option 1, test flexibility before anything else. Option 2, straighten the body before strengthening it. Option 3, always start with a maximal strength test. Option 4, assess balance last, regardless of findings. Take a moment to think it through. The correct answer is option 2, straighten the body before strengthening it. Here's why. ACE's functional assessments check posture and movement quality before anything gets loaded with resistance. That straighten before strengthen order is the organizing principle behind the entire assessment sequence. Here's your second practice question. Which of the following is one of ACE's 4 movement screens? Option 1, vertical jump test. Option 2, hurdle step. Option 3, 1 rep max back squat. Option 4, VO2 max treadmill test. Take a moment to think it through. The correct answer is option 2, hurdle step. Here's why. The 4 movement screens are the bend and lift screen, the hurdle step, shoulder push stabilization, and thoracic spine mobility. The other options, a vertical jump, a 1 rep max squat, a VO2 max test, are performance or physiological tests, not movement quality screens. Let's wrap up with the key takeaways from this lesson. Functional assessments follow straighten before strengthen, posture first, then movement, then more specific testing layered on top. The static postural assessment checks the body at rest, viewed from the front, the side, and the back. The 4 movement screens are bend and lift, hurdle step, shoulder push stabilization, and thoracic spine mobility. Core function testing looks at deep stabilizer engagement, specifically the TVA, not just raw abdominal strength. And balance is checked both statically and dynamically, while flexibility testing targets the muscles that tend to pull posture out of alignment. Hold on to these 5 points. They tie directly into how you'll build a client's program in the lessons ahead. That's a wrap on Lesson 7. In Lesson 8, we're moving into physiological assessments, body composition, cardiorespiratory testing, and muscular strength and endurance. We'll also cover when and why you'd stop a test partway through. See you in the next lesson.